Hello and welcome, bienvenidos, to another edition of Drop the Mic Mondays. My name is Ollie. I'm sorry, go ahead, Natasha.
Sorry, I was just celebrating with you.
All right. My name's Ollie. I'm a campaign coordinator here at About Face. I'm a military veteran. Drop the Mic Mondays is About Face's venue for us as vets to come together with people within our community, outside our community, anybody, everybody, to talk about anti-militarism, anti-war, demilitarization, decolonization. Hopefully y'all out there have gotten a chance to see our episodes on the Red Hill fuel spill in Hawaii and trans inclusion in the military and all the other great episodes that we've done. And if you're enjoying the content and you want to see more, make sure you follow us at Vets About Face on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, and soon TikTok. It's coming. And we have another great episode for you today. And I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Natasha to introduce our guest and to provide some context.
Hey, Ali. Yeah, thanks everyone for joining us. I'm Natasha, the organizing director here at About Face Veterans Against the War, Air Force veteran, saying a lot of things. What comes up for me oftentimes is moral injury for having participated in U.S. imperialism under the disguise of patriotism and defending democracy. And so today's discussion really is, like Ali said, drop the mic, the military industrial complex, because we know that it impacts us in a myriad of ways every day, not just abroad, but very well here in our very own communities, right? And so today we wanted to have a conversation on current events, right? And so we can have the conversation of not just this distant thing that happens in decision making and corporate, profit through the Department of Defense, but how it impacts you in your own community. So I'm excited for us to be able to talk today around the militarism that we see happening in public schools, right? And then to that extension, I would also add at the college level, particularly community college, where the military-industrial complex does have a huge footprint and a proliferated footprint in schools that service predominantly Black, Hispanic, Latinx, marginalized, indigenous communities, right? And so Chicago, which is the third largest school district in the nation, happens to be one of them. And so joining us today is Alex Rupenthal. Hey, Alex, thanks for being on with us today, who's a Chicago journalist. Hey, who writes investigative and in-depth stories on the government and corporate accountability, energy, environment, education, extremism, surveillance, and the impact of counter-extremism programs on marginalized communities. His work is published in the Better Government Association, Chicago Magazine, Chicago Reporter, Crane's Chicago Business, the Chicago Tribune, and including Energy News Network. Welcome, Alex. It's good to be on with you again. I believe it was about this time last year we were on a virtual live community event discussing your very first piece that was sort of the springboard to the investigation in your latest piece. So, give us some context, talk about the arc of what brought, us to a point to where the third largest school district in the nation has essentially acknowledged that there's been forced enrollment in the junior ROTC program that overwhelmingly enrolls Black, Hispanic, Latinx, marginalized youth. I think to the tune of 95% of those enrolled. And we often see them in the under-enrolled or resource-poor schools, right? And so really glad to have you on. To hear this acknowledgement is huge, and definitely sent there was a wave of applause to be at this point across the community. So fill us in and talk a little bit about how this got started and where we are now.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you, Natasha and Ollie for having me. I'm really happy to be here. So as you mentioned, last year I worked with the education news organization Shockbeat on the first story into this kind of phenomenon of forced or automatic enrollment in JROTC programs. This was based on sort of the start of this really was advocates and others who had been tracking this practice for several years in Chicago and had been kind of gathering data to show that this was going on. That sort of got me to start looking into it. We obtained enrollment data from Chicago Public Schools to see where where students were taking the program and what grades they were. And as Natasha mentioned, what we found was that in about 10 schools across CPS, essentially the entire freshman class at these schools, either 100% of the class or 90% or more, were being placed in JROTC by default. So they didn't have a choice about whether to enroll their families or anything. And that's sort of the story that we broke last year with Chalkbeat, that this was happening. Obviously, it raised a lot of concerns. I think one can certainly talk about the JROTC program itself, and there's plenty of debate over that program and its existence in schools. Our reporting, though, was even separate kind of from any sort of debate over the program itself. It was that all these students, hundreds of students, again from predominantly Black and Latino high schools, were being essentially forced into this program, and that was something that most people we spoke with thought was not right. Fast forward to this year, as reporting, the Inspector General of Chicago Public Schools opened an investigation into this practice. The Inspector General recently finalized its investigation, which essentially confirmed what we had found with Chalkbeat, and then also went further and examined some of these enrollment practices a little bit deeper than we did, obviously with a whole team of researchers and investigators and closer access to people in the district. And so not only did the Inspector General find that this forced enrollment was happening, they found that when students and parents tried to opt their out of the program, there was really no clear way on how to do that. There was no procedure. It was sometimes students weren't even able to opt out of the program even when they tried. The Inspector General found there was one school that was over enrolling students with disabilities in the program. At this particular school, students with disabilities made up about 9% of the school's total enrollment, but accounted for 68% of JROTC participants. One student, the Inspector General found, had objected to being in JROTC because of her religion, and she and her mom had sort of raised that objection, and still the student wasn't able to opt out of the program. The Inspector General had asked the JROTC instructors in Chicago for, they said they were distributing these parental consent forms showing that students and their families had consented to be in the program, but none of those instructors were able to sort of provide a sampling of consent forms when they were requested by the Inspector General. Some even said that those forms been destroyed, which was kind of curious, I know, to the investigators from the district. And then lastly, kind of another finding was that JROTC enrollment at 6 different schools here in Chicago was actually below the threshold that federal law requires to maintain the program. It's either 10% of a student body being enrolled in JROTC or 100 students. So those programs technically were not meeting the requirements that the Army and the various branches establish. So anyway, that's sort of a summary of the findings. Based on all this, Chicago Public Schools has said that it is going to change the way it enrolls students in the program to stop this practice of forced enrollment. Starting next year, they've said there will be a standardized permission form that has to be signed by parents before a student can be enrolled. And the district has said that it's going to implement a number of other changes to sort of make sure this isn't happening, conducting audits of the program, training principals on JROTC, and emphasizing that it's not supposed to be used as sort of a replacement for PE class, which is what we found was often the case here in Chicago. So that's sort of the maybe a not so brief summary of what we found in our reporting, and then what the the district's investigators have also found. I'm sure I'm leaving something out, but I'll wrap it up there. And Natasha, and feel free if you feel like I missed anything, or to answer anyone's questions about the reporting.
Yeah, thanks for that, Alex. I think what comes up for me is, I mean, this was really my reintroduction to the district. I'm a product alum of Chicago Public Schools. I've said this many times before. I didn't have an option when I was in high school in terms of whether or not to join JROTC. And for me, it was a recruitment tool. And so I am very clear about that. Ultimately during my senior year, I took an oath and enlisted before I'd even graduated high school at the age of 17. Right, I can tell you that I had no idea what JROTC doesn't prepare you for what or at least what I participated in, and just knowing that I did that under the guise of for benefits, whether it was for education or what have you. So when we have conversations in the community about JROTC and we're talking to young people, overwhelmingly, it's, presented to them as this option and a way out. Well, in actual contrast, what we're finding is once we have communities as families, like as parents, I know you interviewed several parents that I know very well, who are local and elected school council members who had issue with, I think you mentioned like principals bringing in JROTC and not consulting the school community. And there was, some definite pushback there. And I think, for me is oftentimes when folks think like, oh, well, you're trying to take away JROTC. Well, the thing is, there are actually options that can be used instead of JROTC. For example, in Chicago, local school council members who are elected by the school community to help co-govern the school and make decisions, leverage the budget, hire the principal, and also participate in the school's academic curriculum. They can choose from a myriad of career technical education. For example, business, agriculture, and culinary and hospitality, education and training, health sciences, law and public safety, manufacturing, pre-engineering, transportation. Chicago is a movement city. We're a global hub. Why don't we have more transportation tracks in our school? And so I'm curious, in your reporting, did any of this come up in terms of how JROTC is actually a pool, actually pulls resources out of schools, thereby continuing this divestment of opportunities for young students, particularly those who need them the most?
Yeah, I think I know at one school that we wrote about at Chalkbeat in this reporting was Martin Luther King college prep on the south side of the city, and that school had applied, Natasha, for one of those career technical education programs around the time it was in this new JROTC program, and school didn't end up getting that other program, which was disappointing to members of the community and the local school council. They did get the JROTC program, and I think it's like you kind of mentioned, it's impossible to look at this issue. It's of course connected with the realities that many of these are facing. The schools where students were forced into this program were often schools with declining enrollments, smaller schools, and based on the way that Chicago budgets for its schools, those schools don't have as much need to go out and add some of these other types of programs, or at least that's what their principals have said. So yeah, I think it is, and that's where it's I guess tricky in a way with JROTC. The program is subsidized by the federal government. The DoD does pay a portion of of instructor salaries. It's by no means free to the school district. I know Chicago Public Schools paid some like $6 million last year for its instructors. But the way the principals see it, it's cheaper for them to hire JROTC instructors than to bring in, say, another PE teacher. And so a lot of them sort of characterize this as a financial decision that also allowed them to bring in some sort of different program that that in some cases students have liked. So but it's that's certainly, Natasha, has been the part of the pushback, was that there are other options out there, and that I know some people would like to see their schools focus more on bringing those other types of programs in.
I'm curious as well, in your reporting, if you have an idea of what kind of failures like allowed this to happen within the school district, or if it even is a failure, if this is something that there wasn't typically oversight for. And maybe to just as an addendum to that question, what sort of influence does the military have within the school to implement their will?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. We know that the district made aware of concerns about this practice of forced enrollment going back several years, maybe even as early as 2016, in letters and advocates speaking to the Board of Education, and it seems like nothing really was done about it. What the responses I often received when I would ask, as part of our reporting, we contacted U.S. Army Cadet Command, which is the department responsible for oversight of JROTC, and they'll say, and this is in some of the reporting, that enrollment practices are a school decision, are a district decision. So there's sort of a which is true, but there's a bit of a deflecting at saying it's up to the schools. And then what's happening at each school can be different. Even when the head of CBS's JROTC department said that enrollment, the procedures, the process is up to each individual school. So then even when you zoom into the school district, it's that, oh well, yes, we have this central office, but it's up to each school. So that was sort of the response that we got in our reporting. At the district, I think, and if you read their responses to this Inspector General investigation that we reported on last week, definitely agreed that they thought this should not be happening. They did acknowledge that they did not agree with this practice of forced enrollment. They clearly felt like that this shouldn't have been going on, and at least are saying that they're going to take steps to talk it. But Ollie, I think that's one of the issues. The oversight is probably like a lot of other things. That it's not always clear who's in charge, who has the say, and like a lot of things in schools, the reality of what's happening in any particular school is can be unique, and it can be hard to figure out from a reporter's perspective, from anyone who's looking at this, how it's working in each school, especially a district the size of CPS. So I think it's part of the issue. Now the district has said they're going to start doing audits of how enrollment in JROTC. So it sounds like there may be a little bit more oversight from the district's perspective, but that's definitely been one of the challenges, as not really knowing who's in charge or who would be in charge of doing something to stop this practice.
That's really interesting, and I think it mirrors recruitment on an individual basis too, where because like these decisions are left up to the schools, the poorer and less funded schools are more vulnerable to them, just like poorer, unsupported people are more vulnerable to military recruiters on an individual level. I'm curious as well, are there other school programs that are affected by this sort of reliance on JROTC? maybe not a reliance, but yeah, you spoke about how it's replacing physical education in some instances, and we've talked about technical training, how it's been a barrier to that. Is there anything else that's been impacted by this heavy JROTC presence?
I'm not sure about that. I'm sure there'll be examples out there. But yeah, that you mentioned PE again, I just wanted to expand on that a little bit. In Illinois, it's a requirement for high schoolers to take PE every day by law, and JROTC, kind of qualifies as a replacement for a traditional physical education class, to make sure everyone kind of understood how that works. What's interesting is in this some of my latest reporting, there's actually some research showing that that students who take JROTC don't get much moderate to vigorous exercise as they do PE classes. There was a study kind of looking at whether JROTC is actually a proper alternative to PE. And so that's sort of another way that this could be affecting students. There's so much research out there, obviously, on the benefits of physical activity to, in education. And at least according to, some of the research that's out there, there is some evidence showing that students in JROTC aren't getting as much of that sort of beneficial physical activity as they might in a regular PE class. So that's kind of just another wrinkle in this. But I don't really have too much insight as to how it might be affecting other electives. Again, a lot of times the schools where this has occurred, at least in Chicago, are ones that are struggling to bring in any of those types of programs. So it would be interesting what they might do if the school decided they did the JROTC program, then what would it look like then? I think that's sort of difficult to know. But.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, and if we're clear, if this was such a great program, there would be more diversity in enrollment. Let's be very clear. We have in Chicago, I see in many other cities reporting, what feels like an apartheid school district, where there are schools that have overwhelming amount of resources, trade options, international curriculum and opportunities. And we see that reflective in their post-secondary, plans, and not just plans, but them finishing, right? And then we see those who, JROTC, again, the demographics are 95% Black and Hispanic and marginalized, and students with special needs, enrollment. And I think what is important there is what else could they have to help with post-secondary options, and so you can have these trades in high school, and then you graduate high school, and then you go to the community college and complete this accreditation and have access to good livable wage jobs and careers. That should be the pipeline in our city, and the fact that we don't have that is reason why I think we should continue to organize, have conversations like these. Alex, I think we should plan another community conversation to talk about this latest piece, because I think now local school councils can see that, okay, now that this is an acknowledgement, they can participate at the local level to help have some accountability, and then also go back out and ask again for those career technical education options to be added into their building. So I think that this is one of those things that has really had pressure building from the community for decades. I know Chicago Veterans for Peace members would go every month and speak to the board about this trend. And it would build, some community discourse. But I think this acknowledgement isn't getting, I think as much press and information that we can share with everyone, I think will be a benefit a benefit to the community, right? So I'm curious. I have one final question before we let you go. Is there anything that you're looking at in terms of outside of Chicago? Is this what's next in terms of reporting on forced JROTC enrollment that you want to share with folks so that maybe we can have, more understanding of what's happening on a larger scale?
Yeah, no, thank you for asking, Tasha. Yeah, I am very interested in learning whether this practice is going on elsewhere around the country. I know we probably have people from all across the U.S. here today, so it's something that I've kind of started to look into a little bit. But I would love if there is anyone out there that sort of has a pulse on JROTC or on military programs in schools in their area. I would love to hear from them, and especially if they're aware that students have been or are being enrolled in the program sort of automatically, or whether it's not automatically. There's questions of consent and whether parents are providing consent for their students to sign up. That's not technically a requirement per what I've heard from the military branches, but it's something that I think a lot of parents and students have wanted. So that is one thing I'm trying to do next, is to figure out where, if anywhere, this is happening. So would love to hear from anyone about that, or about anything else having to do with military recruitment or other programs in schools.
So we have your contact information up here on the screen, and also we dropped it in the chat. So if you are doing work around this in your area, if you're interested in ways and you don't know what to look for, definitely reach out, and let's see what we can get going that way. There's one question from the chat that's here, Alex. It says, is this Army JROTC specific?
Yeah, great question. In Chicago, the findings was this was only happening in Army JROTC programs. So there was no evidence of forced enrollment in JROTC programs linked to other branches. The overwhelming majority of JROTC programs in Chicago are Army programs. So yeah, but that's a good question. It was just the Army JROTC programs where this had been happening.
Yeah, that is a good point. That, I mean, if folks are interested, I think here in Chicago, it's pretty transparent. You can go to Google your school district, and perhaps it'll give you a way. Here, you could just Google Chicago JROTC, and it takes you straight to the school district, and they have a fact page on the school district, linked from the school district site. So that's one way. If you're not sure what type of programs, what type of JROTC, where they're located, what inequities do you find when you see that research? That's also interesting. And and I know parents in Chicago who are working with Alex, who have reported in the previous article, who would probably be happy to work and talk to parents who are interested in organizing in their own school district as well. Thanks so much, Alex, for joining us. Ali, do you have any questions for Alex before we move on and talk about some more current events?
I don't. Thank you very much, Alex. That was really enlightening.
Yeah, thank you all for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. Take care. Be well. Be in touch.
Bye-bye.
Peace. All right. Ali, where should we begin? I feel like talking about, again, so today we're having this conversation around current events as it relates to the military industrial complex, right? listening to Alex and just, reflecting on like, why do we have this proliferation of JROTC in our schools? And it is actually, less talked about, but during the Bush administration, there was the No Child Left Behind Act. Remember that? If anybody recalls, that was initiated, and it talked about, testing and a lot of things, but it also mandated that school districts that received federal funding must give access, pretty much opened the door, the floodgates, if you will, to JROTC programs and military recruiters. So like places like Chicago, where, the third largest school district, it definitely is reflective, that you could see a market increase from that era, the No Child Left Behind Act, to where we are today. So when that was enacted, you saw the complete flip of those trades being pulled out of schools, because they were there, and they were being replaced with JROTC as a cost savings and discipline for, those students, which goes into that, an old racial trope that says if they're not in jail, they're in the military. Or people remember when, you might know someone who said, yeah, in order to not go to jail, the judge told me I could enlist to avoid that time. Right. So we know that young folks in cities like Chicago, that is a tourist city, a global city, deserves to have resource reallocation to fund the things that they need to feel whole. So it was good to have him on, and I think about that, and then it brings me to this segue, Bush. Were you able to catch this?
I was just saying, no incentive for George Bush to increase military recruiting during that time either, right? He wasn't starting wars or anything that he needed some more folks for. But yeah, I think I know where you're going. I was able to see that interview. I'm sorry, he was giving a speech, and I apologize. I don't have the context of where he was speaking. But he was speaking on the Ukraine, and as he's needing to criticize Putin, he says Iraq instead of Ukraine, but says the rest of the stuff about Putin, right? I can't remember the specific verbiage, but he's calling him a dictator and brutal and this and that. And then he says Iraq, and he has to stop and think about it, and he has a little chuckle. And so does the rest of the room. And it really hurt to see the truth on display. It's like, oh, he said the truth just now, that he is guilty of the same thing that he's accusing Putin of. But instead of acknowledging this at all, we're all just going to have a good chuckle about it. How did it hit you? Probably not great, huh?
No, it didn't. But, my grandma always said a guilty conscience needs no accuser. I definitely, feel like it was an acknowledgement. We see it in other things that he's done. I think this isn't his first acknowledgement. I think the paintings, I'll just say that definitely is an acknowledgement. But I think it was the chuckle in the room. Like, who are the people in the room who laughed at that? Right? Like, that just strikes me as, I don't know, a couple of things, but worst of all, like, we know what the Iraq War did and the impacts that it's had on people, in Iraq, in the region, and for all those who have been impacted by the Iraq and Afghanistan, wars over the past 20 years, is definitely not funny.
No, it was very ugly, and I'm sure a lot of people in this world laugh when they're uncomfortable, so I don't want to think the worst about everyone, but what I wouldn't have given to have Mike Preisner in the room at that moment, or someone that just would have stood up and called him out on that, because I mean, what a moment that was to have him really slip like that in front of everybody and tell the truth. And as he's speaking on Ukraine, which is a place that we're escalating by sending lots of weapons to. So, speaking of people that have given a medal to George Bush, Joe Biden, I believe on Friday, was asked if he would use the military to intervene in Taiwan if China should invade. And he answered yes, but don't worry. Fortunately, the White House or one of his reps walked that back and said that they meant that they would only send them arms. So this is very much, if it's not already clear to you, a business model. We don't care about people in Ukraine or Taiwan. This country sells weapons, and that's the underlying motivation of a lot of these decisions. Also, imperialism. And it's just another example of how overtly ugly we're allowed to be right now, where we're openly talking about sending weapons all over the world and people think of it as aid. And I think that part of the reason that we've gotten here is because of George Bush and all the wars that he started. People think that this is a better alternative to what we were doing before, but they're not stopping to think about how we could not be doing this at all. Or maybe they don't think it's possible. I don't know. I'm not hanging out with all of you every day. But it's just, I think it's very overt how our interests are very much tied up in selling weapons. So another thing going on today. How do you feel? How did you catch that one, Natasha?
I did. And I also, it is a business model. It is definitely in the DNA, of the U.S., at least in recent memory. I can't think of a time. And then, what really does stick out to me is let's be careful, or let's pay attention to what history has also taught us, is that when we see this proliferation of arms and escalation happening outside of our borders, we also know that on the back end, the Department of Defense's 1033 program, which oftentimes because there's excess spending on foreign military equipment, there's always this revolving door that those weapons, vehicles, war tools ends up in our cities, particularly those that need resources, mental health treatment, and fresh food and housing. Oftentimes end up, experiencing the brunt of that militarized equipment. And so there's this real close connection that I see, even in my community, around what history has shown us. So we need to be careful and continue to lift our voices and talk about the militarization in our own communities. What are your thoughts on just thinking about, really being also focused too on what's happening at home?
I think I wish I had this story to link with me, but those 1033 programs are so successful at putting military equipment into police departments that they had extra equipment to send to Ukraine. Police departments are sending extra excess equipment to Ukraine, and that's the business of our country, is those arms. Caging people, killing people, arms. That's our number one exports or industry, however you would put it.
Yeah. There's this article that I'm going to drop here that I think is a pretty good read for folks who, may not remember, who George, W. Bush is, as we're talking about what's being called a Freudian slip or gaffe. It is by Jacobin. Media that says it's always the right time to call George W. Bush a war criminal. I would also encourage and remind folks to read the Afghanistan papers. You can Google it. It is not behind a paywall, to refresh your memory on, the lies that we were told about the wars and the progress that was happening. And then also check out the Cost of War Project, which is doing Brown University's, anti-militarization project that they're doing. So there's scholars, there's folks from across the communities who's, reporting real time on the impacts on people. That includes sanctions. That includes everywhere that the military industrial complex is, profiting with military participation in conflicts, particularly that we don't talk about enough across the Horn of Africa. We know that U.S.-backed, attacks have happened here recently that don't always make it to across mainstream media. So it's always important to, just remember that how connected, this is. Mainstream media is talking about this thing. There's 99 others happening in the background that impact and have an extension on this many-legged monster that is the military-industrial complex. Those are some of my thoughts. Ollie, what else is on your mind this current event Monday?
Well, it seems that we are now willing to walk back some select sanctions on Venezuela because, and this is me reading between the lines, of oil, because of the situation going on with Ukraine and the loss of Russia's imports to Europe. It seems pretty obvious to me that we're trying to come up with some extra oil so that we can come into those markets. So officially, I believe that the one of the conditions of the easing of these sanctions, and these sanctions, if you're not already aware, are very devastating to Venezuela. They've caused a lot of migration. They've caused extreme poverty within Venezuela. And also, while all this is going on, we are backing basically our puppet as a candidate in Venezuela against the will of the Venezuelan people. So part of the conditions for easing these sanctions is that their actual duly elected leader enter into talks with the person that we would like to be their leader. And it's quite egregious. At no point were we ever considering lifting these sanctions to ease any sort of suffering on the people that live in Venezuela. This is solely due to the natural resources that they have. And this is another theme that we see in all of our dealings abroad, is we are always very concerned where there are resources that we would like, whether it would be oil, which is, seems to be our number one addiction, but there's others too. Lithium typically is not ethically mined from anywhere, and that is all going into our electric cars and all these different computer components and whatnot. So this is just another example of what is important to your and our government, is it's actually these resources and all of these business dealings. They need crude oil from Venezuela, and thus they are no longer, as our government, is no longer morally objectionable to their government, and we will begin dealing with you again because it suits us. And that is to say that we've caused starvation amongst folks for economic reasons. It was never for anything else other than economic reasons and interests of our country and our neoliberal interests. And it's hard to look at, but we have to, because it's still going on. We're still sanctioning so many other countries as well. We're still selling arms to Saudi Arabia to do the same thing in Yemen, where they're suffering from starvation. So that's why it's all the more important that we continue to have these talks. And we hope, those of you out there are watching along with us. And if you're being exposed to some of these things for the first time, I hope that you're going to keep investigating for yourself, because the government and our news media is not going to go out of their way to inform you about it. And if you are already familiar, welcome. I look forward to being in struggle with you more. We need to get together. I will step down off of my soapbox, Natasha. I hope I did not ramble too much.
No, you didn't. That was on point. Thanks, Ali. Yeah, I think, whether you're a scholar, you're someone who's doing work in your community, a journalist, an artist, a parent, a fellow veteran, we would love to have you join us on the show, on the podcast, every Monday at 2 p.m. Eastern. where we talk about the military industrial complex. Today, we wanted to sort of have a mashup, if you will, on current events that's happening, and really excited and grateful for Alex for coming on and spending time with us, who's an independent journalist who recently wrote around the forced JROTC enrollment in Chicago and has put out a call for folks who might be doing that work in their community to reach out. His contact information is linked in the chat. And so, yeah, we want to continue to have conversations like this one. If you're doing work, if you have a, topic or idea around, dropping the military industrial complex, which is our campaign here at About Face Veterans Against War, where we want to have virtual conversations when it's safe to do so. We would love to have retreats and have folks join us for workshops where we can organize together and do this collective work at the grassroots level with folks who are experienced by this every single day. And so if you don't know this, that we are looking to shift resources from the Pentagon budget, which is bloated. I don't know, what is the budget now, Ollie? What's the
You're going to put me on blast like that, huh?
No, I can't remember. I think it was like, isn't it going close to like 800 billion?
Yeah, it goes up so often that I actually don't know the current number, but that is something in that market. And it goes up every time. I can't remember a time it has not increased. And I'm sure there's instances, but it has been steadily increasing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, the more we think about the resources that so quickly, oftentimes without debate, shifted from our communities where we need them. I don't know about you all, but this inflation is starting to really pinch, if it hasn't already, for a lot of folks that, there's a lot of need in our communities. And then when there's a high level of need like this, we know that our communities are less safe and we start to see intracommunal violence spike. And so it really is a public safety concern that we see those dollars be shifted again into our communities and away from the DoD and the corporate profits that have a lion's share of the DoD spending. So thank you. Someone, our member here in the chat, Chris, is saying that the anticipated budget is going to be $813 billion for FY 22-23.
And you could bet that does not include the money they're sending to Ukraine. So it's really much more than that.
And even this, I was having a conversation with my neighbor who was like, well, it's, there's no, denying, true humanitarianism, right? But when we see this being a lot of the funding that's going over, and by the way, those billions that's being sent to Ukraine is, very much overwhelmingly going to corporations. It's not going to address the hunger and the all of the insecurities that we're seeing in countries in the region as well. And so again, making the world less safe. And the billions that are being sent is only for or through September, right? And so this is what we saw in the history of shifting resources and these incremental like mission creeps or spending creeps, right? And so it's important for everyone to speak out, call your legislator, call your senator, your representative, and voice your concern around shifting the resources and prioritizing dollars that make us all safe. And then I see here in the chat other members who are talking about, let's see here, Jules is saying that there's always scarcity when they want to forgive student debt and fund climate change initiatives, but no scarcity to fund war. That is right, Jules. We see a lot of representatives speaking out against even just forgiving student debt, which we know can actually help our communities, and the impacts are far and wide, but there was zero debate around releasing those billions of dollars abroad. And we saw that last year. What was it last year? Where there was a huge debate around sending the American people $600 like a funky $600 during a global pandemic, you know? So that definitely is a
I don't believe universal healthcare is yet to even make it to the floor of anything, let alone have us put any sort of dollar and commitment to it. I heard that the amount that we've sent to Ukraine is the amount that we sent to Israel in a singular year. We are out aiding the rest of the European continent to Ukraine by several fold. And I too am for humanitarianism, but it's clear to me that's not what's happening here. And it's a really tough position to be in, to have to speak out on this, because people don't want to hear that. They want to think that all of that money is truly humanitarian. And I wish it was. I wish we could come on here and say, Joe Biden is truly helping Ukraine, but we're going to tell you the truth instead, because we're not here to make you happy. And yeah, we just invest so much money everywhere but here, unless it's to keep people in cages and police them. Then we also have plenty of money for that. And I really hope everybody out there, veteran or otherwise, is feeling fed up, because it's going to take all of us from every walk and color and background to be able to do anything about this. We're up against some real serious problems, and we need to have some solidarity.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. This was a great discussion today, Ollie. I think that we are, it's always on our mind what types of discussions, how we can continue to have this, conversation around militarism and how it impacts our daily lives. This discussion in and of itself really did feel like we're scratching the surface. And I hope that folks who are either joining us live, oftentimes folks are at work and listen later on, engage with us across our social media. We are streaming across Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter via Periscope. Drop a comment. We would love to engage. Send us an inbox or a DM on an idea. If you would like to join us in the discussion around how we drop the mic, the military-industrial complex, so that we can shift to a more regenerative, restorative, and healing community for us all. Thank you for joining us. I appreciate y'all who are here giving us reflections in the chat. It's always good to be in community. We'll be back on Monday, May 31st, for a special episode of Drop the Mic Mondays, covering Memorial Day and why we need to cut the militarism out of that holiday as well. So we'll see you here next week at 2 p.m. Eastern, where we drop the mic. Peace, y'all.